What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Resident Evil video, and welcome to the Mod Kid channel. On the TierMaker app, I found somebody that made a tier list with 33 of some of the most iconic monsters in the Resident Evil franchise, so I decided I was going to go through this tier list and rank what I think is the best monsters in the RE franchise, from worst to best. There is some monsters that I wish were included in this tier list, but I didn't actually make a tier list and I didn't feel like making my own this time around, so we're just gonna have to say screw it and go with what we got. So the first one starting off our tier list here is gonna be the Whopper from RE6. I'm just gonna go ahead and put the Whopper down at the F rank, which is gonna be the lowest rank in this tier list. But the reason why I'm going to put the Whopper so low is just because he's kind of an easy enemy to take down. All you really need is enough ammo to take him down, and luckily enough for us in RE6, they give us a whole lot of ammo, so you always seem to have plenty of ammo to go around. But next up now, making its way in the B rank, is going to be the Fat Molded from RE7. I just decided to put this one in the B rank because I don't think the Fat Molded are that much of a threat, and they're also not that much of an iconic monster in the series as well. But when it comes to the molded types, the Fat Molded is definitely the best one and the strongest one in my opinion. So the Fat Molded are going to be in the B rank, but moving on now is the Knights from Resident Evil 4, which I'm going to go ahead and put just down in the C rank. The Knights are a type of enemy that you don't really have to deal with that much. In fact, you only really see them in the castle sections of RE4, and they're pretty easy to deal with, especially if you have a flash grenade and you know to shoot all their heads to expose their parasites. So they're going to go ahead and stay down in the C rank, but moving on to the next one is going to be the Big Man Magini from RE5. This one I'm going to put in the C rank as well, but I'm going to put it above the Knights just because I think the Big Man Maginis are a little bit tougher to take down than the Knights are in RE4. And there isn't really a specific weapon that the Big Man Maginis are vulnerable to, so you pretty much just have to pump a lot of ammo into them to take them down. But now coming up next is one of the monsters that terrified me the most growing up as a kid, and that is the giant spiders. The giant spiders are going to be the first ones making it up in the A rank just because they are one of the most classic and iconic monsters in the Resident Evil franchise. And also with their unique ability to poison you, which is quite similar to what spiders can do IRL. They're definitely one of those monsters that you just don't want to have to deal with, unless I suppose you have a blue herb nearby. But now our next monster in this tier list, being the first one up in the S rank, is going to be Dr. Salvador from Resident Evil 4. The introduction to an enemy having a chainsaw in Resident Evil 4 was absolutely wild. And that first cutscene in the village when you see Dr. Salvador for the first time was absolutely terrifying when you play that game at a very young age like I did. I believe Dr. Salvador became an instant classic in the Resident Evil franchise for monsters, so I think he definitely deserves the S rank. But coming up next is these enemies from Resident Evil 5, which I know I'm going to get their names wrong, but I believe they're called the Duvalia. I went ahead and put these monsters in the C rank because they're quite like the Knights, where the flash grenade seems to be their weakness, and if you throw a flash grenade down, these enemies are just going to fall down and die instantly. But coming up next here is the zombie dogs from the more modern Resident Evil games. I went ahead and put these zombie dogs in the middle here of the tier list at the B rank because I do really like the new style for the zombie dogs and how they move faster and more sporadically. But altogether, they're just about as easy to take down as any zombie dog in the Resident Evil franchise, except for when you're talking about the split head dogs, because those ones are really no joke. Alright, keeping on the topic of RE5, we're now going to be moving on to the Giant Magini, which I'm going to go ahead and put in the F rank. They're pretty similar to the Whoppers in my opinion. They're big enemies that seem pretty menacing, but if you have enough ammo and just keep going at them, then they're just going to fall over and die pretty quickly. Also, you only have to deal with these enemies during the village and ancient ruins sections of RE5, so the giant Maginis definitely aren't that iconic or memorable in the RE franchise. But now moving on to one of the most memorable and iconic monsters in the Resident Evil franchise, and that is the Hunters. The Hunters are going to be making their way at the top of the S rank just because not only they are one of the most memorable monsters, but they're also one of the quickest and most lethal monsters in the Resident Evil franchise. There's some hunter types that can poison you, and all around there's just so many different types of hunters in Resident Evil, and all of them are very dangerous to fight. So now with another classic monster in Resident Evil making its way into the top of the A rank is going to be the Ivy, or the plant zombies. They're pretty scary to run into in the OG RE2 just because they have the ability to poison you, and that's something you don't want when you don't have a blue herb on you. But in RE2 Remake, they're also very dangerous in their own right, because if they get a hold of you, then they can just instant kill you, unless of course you have a sub-weapon. Now moving on to a monster that probably shouldn't have been on this list, but we're just going to go with it, and that is the Dravo from RE6. There isn't really much to say about these guys. I mean, I put them at the bottom of the F rank because they're the most standard kind of enemy that's found in RE6, and they're also by far the easiest to take down. The Dravo are going to be staying down in the F rank, and we're going to be moving on to an actual really good monster that was in Resident Evil 4 and is called JJ. They only bring this monster out at very few certain points in Resident Evil 4, but when they do, it's definitely a very unique monster to have to battle. The same kind of monster also reappears in Resident Evil 5 as well, so I'd like to think that the JJ, or the Gatling gun guy, has definitely become kind of a memorable and iconic monster in Resident Evil. Coming up next and going down in the bottom of the C rank is going to be the Kikiburo from Resident Evil 5. The Kikiburo is kind of a difficult enemy to have to fight, especially if you only have the standard kinds of weapons in RE5. But other than that, you only really run into this monster twice in Resident Evil 5, and one of the fights you don't even have to fight it if you don't want to, and you can literally just choose to run. So you don't really see or fight this monster that much, therefore I'm only going to put it in the C rank. But next up, joining these other monsters down here in the F rank is going to be the Lepoticia from Resident Evil 6. This is also one of those monsters that you just really don't experience that much and doesn't appear anywhere outside of Resident Evil 6, so definitely does not go down as a memorable or iconic kind of monster, so I can't rank it very high for that. And it's also pretty weak and easy to take down as well, so that's why it's just going to have to stay down in the F rank. But now moving on is another version of Dr. Salvador, and that is the Chainsaw Magini from Resident Evil 5. This one I'm going to go ahead and have to put at the top of the A rank. I really wanted to put it in the S rank because I like to think that the Chainsaw Magini is just as scary and menacing as the original Dr. Salvador. But yet again, there's something just so good about the original Dr. Salvador that I just can't put the Chainsaw Magini in the S rank. But one monster that I can and will put in the S rank is going to be the Garrador from Resident Evil 4. The Garrador is up there as not only one of the scariest monsters in RE4, but in all of Resident Evil in my opinion, just because they're so quick and move out of nowhere. Luckily for us, the Garrador can't see and only rely on sounds of movement. But next up, I'm placing these high up on the C rank, and that is the Spider Molded from Resident Evil 7. The Spider Molded are pretty much just creepier looking versions of the regular Molded, except for the fact that the Spider Molded are kinda harder to shoot. They also come with a leaping attack, so it kinda forces you to keep your distance from them. Next up is one of the creepiest types of monsters in Resident Evil in my opinion, and that is the Novistadors from Resident Evil 4. The introduction to the Novistadors in the OG RE4 is all around just absolutely terrifying down in the sewers, so these are going to be going down in the B rank. Now next up, also making its way down there in the B rank is going to be the Ooze from Resident Evil Revelations. These guys are just absolutely terrifying to look at for starters, But also, if you don't have a heavy artillery gun and are only stuck with a handgun, then getting past these guys is going to be not so easy. Now, coming up next, if I'm not mistaken, I believe these guys are called the Rascalpangi from Resident Evil 6. I think these guys are actually kind of similar to the oozes from Revelations, but these ones I think are actually more annoying and more difficult to take down. So I went ahead and put the Rascalpangi in the A rank. This type of monster is capable of breaking off into several different limbs, and if that ends up happening, then it becomes really difficult and annoying to be able to kill one of these guys. Sometimes their hands are just crawling around taking swipes at you, and it can be really hard to notice or see them. But moving on to this next monster here, which in my opinion I think is one of the most terrifying and threatening monsters in all of Resident Evil 5, and that is the Reaper. For starters, their weak point is their little white sacks that are scattered along their body, but if you're not able to hit those by the time they're able to get close enough to reach you, then it's just going to be an instant game over. Also, while trying to shoot them, they can display gas around them, which will make it a lot harder to see their weak point. But now, this next monster here is going to be taking the absolute top spot in the S rank for the best and scariest monster in Resident Evil. Yeah, trying to play Resident Evil 4 for the first time and running into your first regenerator is scary enough to absolutely just turn the game off and go put on some cartoons to watch. Not only are they very terrifying to look at and really difficult to take down, but they're also very creepy sounding as well. Now, coming up next is a monster that I'm going to go ahead and put in the S rank, just because they're one of the more iconic and nostalgic kinds of monsters in the original Resident Evil games. The zombie dogs are definitely one of the most iconic kinds of monsters in Resident Evil, and they eventually made their way even into the movies of Resident Evil as well. But the zombie dogs are also responsible for one of the best and most iconic jump scares in original Resident Evil game. So now for this next one, I thought this was a pretty weird entry, but because the guy that made this tier list decided to include it, I'm just gonna go ahead and include it in my tier list. So this next entry is the President from Resident Evil 6. I went ahead and put him in the F rank because you don't really have to deal with him, and you only really see him in the cutscene. So moving on with our next entry is going to be making its way about halfway into the A rank, and that is the Skag Dead from Resident Evil Revelations. The Skag Dead are very creepy and gross looking, quite like the oozes, but I think the Skag Deads are definitely a lot more of a threat, so therefore they're just, I think, a lot more terrifying. I know the Skag Dead have an attack as well that serves as an instant kill, but I'm also aware that not all of their attacks are instant kills. Next up is another monster from Resident Evil Revelations, and that is the Sea Creeper. I went ahead and put this one about in the middle of the tier list at the B rank just because these ones are a really good combination of both annoying and terrifying. Next up is another monster from Resident Evil 6, and I believe they go by the name of the Strelok. I wanted to put these kind of high up on the tier list just because I remember distinctly in my time of playing Resident Evil 6 just how hard it was to actually defeat these monsters. They're not like the typical enemy that just run at you, they actually hide and wait for you to not be looking at them until they make their move. But moving on with our tier list now is one of the creepiest and most iconic monsters in Resident Evil. The Lickers have appeared in many different Resident Evil games and movies, but they are also responsible for what my opinion is one of the best jump scares in all of RE history, and that is the two-way mirror in RE2. Yeah, that jump scare still gets me to this day, but moving on with our next entry is gonna be the Magini from Resident Evil 5. Even though they're the standard type of enemy, I went ahead and I put them in the C rank just because the Magini are my favorite kinds of standard enemies in the Resident Evil franchise, just for the pure fact that they're one of the creepiest. The Ouroboros thing coming out of their mouth is just all around really creepy looking to look at. So moving on with our next entry here is gonna be the Ganado from Resident Evil 4. I went ahead and put the Ganados in the C rank as well just because they have a lot of different Ganado types. The Ganados appear all throughout the village, the castle, and the island sections of RE4, and they're always super creepy just because they're yelling at you in Spanish and you can never understand what they're saying to you. But wrapping up this tier list now with our final entry, and one of the most classic of classic monsters is of course the standard zombies. I wanted to obviously rank these ones based off of the ones that are the most iconic and reappearing in the Resident Evil games, but compared to all the other great monsters in this tier list, the casual zombies really do not hold a torch compared to all these other great monsters. So therefore, that's going to go ahead and wrap up my tier list of the best monsters in the Resident Evil franchise. But now, before we get out of here, I want to go through and review each of my entries from top to bottom so you guys can see if you agree or disagree with my entries. So starting us off here at the top, and in my opinion, the best monsters in Resident Evil are the Lickers, the Regenerators, the Hunters, the Garrador, Dr. Salvador, the Reaper, JJ, and the classic zombie dogs. Next up in the A rank are the Chainsaw Majinis, the Ivy, the Skag Dead, the Rascalapangi, the Giant Spiders, and the Strelok. Next up in the middle of our tier list, in the B rank, we have the Fat Molded, the modern version for the zombie dogs, the Novistadors, the Ooze, and the Sea Creeper. Now down here in the C rank, we have the Duvalia, the Spider Molded, the Big Man Majini, the Knight, the Kikiburo, the Majini, and the Ganados. Now, lastly, in the F rank, and the worst monsters in my opinion, are the Molded, the Giant Majini, the Lepoticia, the Whopper, the classic normal zombies, the Dravo, and the President from RE6. So, there we have it guys, that is my tier list of the best monsters, and if you guys went on to enjoy and agree with this list, then drop a big like on this video. And I also post every single day, so make sure you guys subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss a single daily upload. Also, before I get out of here, I'd like to leave a very special shout out to my one and only YouTube Pro member, Ico Pro Sam. Hopefully you guys all go on to have a good rest of your day, and with that being said, I will see you all in the next video tomorrow. Peace.